worst part, they change the rules constantly based on whatever they deem to be politically correct at any given point in time. These rules and standards are often changed without the knowledge of their users, moving the goalposts on Floridians and others who use these open forums for discourse and as a source for information. When a social media company applies these standards unequally on users, this is discrimination, pure and simple. Can you imagine tolerating this kind of behavior in banking or in healthcare or in other industries?
Well, that's a statement by Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor of Florida, a man who has been getting well-deserved kudos from Republicans for his handling of the lockdown. I like him the way he handles the media, and now he wants to handle the big tech companies, and in particular, as you heard there, their political censorship. But how can he, given that the governing law over those affairs is the Communications Decency Act, Section 230 to be particular, that has basically provided a waiver for big tech companies for anything they publish. It has made them immune to lawsuits over content or how they handle content. Donald Trump talked about Section 230 during his term as president. Alas, he did not take meaningful steps during that term, but now the governor steps forward. Joining us now to talk about Ron DeSantis' proposal and whether or not it will make a difference is our friend Allum Bokhari, chief tech correspondent for Breitbart.com. Allum, great to see you again.
Hi, Ezra, good to be on.
You know, I love Ron DeSantis more every day. In many ways, he has Trump's fighting spirit and his understanding that the media is not his friend, but he seems blessedly free of some of Trump's flaws. Every person has strengths and flaws, but I think Ron DeSantis carries the best of Trumpism with him. I'm very excited about him as a governor. What do you think of the man before we get to the Section 230 issue?
I think I agree with that assessment. I mean, he's, as you say, he knows how to handle the media. And he's leading the way on perhaps the biggest issue to the populist right, which is big tech. And I think, these proposals he's come out with he's come out with the massive raft of proposals, probably the most aggressive set of regulations that he plans to impose on big tech that we've seen from any Republican governor. It might have some difficulty in the courts, especially with Section 230 still on the books. But this kind of might be a model, I think, for Republican regulation of big tech going forward.
Well, and that's the thing. I'm not as familiar with American jurisdiction. I mean, in Canada, we have a clear distinction between what the feds can do and what the provinces can do. And this would squarely be a matter for the federal government in Canada. But the United States tilts more towards the states, and individual states can have quite a bit of power, as California shows in its regulatory regime. Can you tell me some of the things that Ron DeSantis proposes to do at the state level? First, tell me what they are, and then if you want to tell me if you think that they have sticking power.
So he's proposing several things. He's proposing a $100,000 a day fine on any tech platform that censors a political candidate or an elected official. And, that doesn't sound like a lot if you're a tech company, but it adds up, over 30 days of $3 million. He's also proposing a private right of action for Floridian citizens who are censored by big tech platforms unfairly. He's planning to impose even more fines on tech companies that censor, that use their algorithms to favor certain candidates or certain political causes ahead of elections. That's very important. And he's also going to empower the Attorney General of Florida to bring suits against the tech companies based on the Florida's Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act. So a whole lot of proposals there that would present a significant problem for the tech companies if they aren't shot down by the federal courts. And that's probably the issue he's going to deal with. But it's good to make a start, good to start the fight. And we'll just have to see how that develops, whether Section 230 ends up superseding it. I'm not really a legal expert, so I can't say with any confidence how that'll turn out, but it's good that the fight has started.
Now, of course, I suggested that DeSantis is in the mold of Trump in his worldview, in his style. Are there any other governors who seem to be sympathetic to this approach who might copy it. I can imagine if you had a few states, Texas, Florida, some big Republican states, and of course the Republicans have the majority of states numerically. They control state houses. Do you think this might spread, and do you think any Democrats might get behind it?
Well, I doubt any Democrats will get behind it if the focus is on censorship. They are doing some interesting things on competition, but they want to increasingly they're trying to tie their enforcement actions that they're proposing against big tech to conditions on cracking down on misinformation or on hate speech. So censoring even more. As far as the other Republican states go, the other man to watch at the moment is the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton. He's leading multi-state lawsuits against Google and the other tech giants, targeting their monopoly power. And he also really understands the censorship issue as well. So that's another one to watch. I will say, you're absolutely right. If Republican states got together and acted as a unit on this issue, they could do some real damage to the tech companies. One interesting proposal I've recently been thinking about is the amount of state government agencies that rely on these tech platforms to put out their messages, to alert the public about what's going on, and also public Wi-Fi. So airports and schools, these are controlled by state governments in many cases. So if all of these state governments got together and say, well, look, if tech companies discriminate on the basis of viewpoint, if they censor political candidates, if they censor the president, then we're not going to allow them on public Wi-Fi until they change their policies. Or we're not going to allow our agencies to use these platforms to put out their announcements. They're going to have to use different platforms. And that wouldn't be a crippling blow to tech companies, but it would do real damage to them, to impose consequences on them. And it would create an incentive for new companies it would create a market for new companies to cater to those, Republican agencies that would be those Republican-controlled agencies that would be looking to put out their announcements on platforms that aren't Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube.
That's a great point. I mean, I often wonder why in our city, we're based here in Toronto, and why the media is so submissive towards the mayor. And I think one of the most obvious answers is because the city hall is one of the largest advertisers in Toronto. So if you tick off the mayor, he might cancel $1 million worth of ads to your newspaper chain, and he'll also give scoops and leaks to your competitor. But I think that the power of the purse is important. It makes me think of that new executive order that Joe Biden signed to push transgenderism into sport and other places, using, I think it's called Title IX. Basically, he's saying if you're a school, a college, an Olympics team that gets any funding from the feds, you got to go full trans or you're going to be cut off. I think it's not so much that he has the legal jurisdiction. He's just saying, if you want my money, you got to do it. I think that if you cut off all advertising, all access to state buildings and assets and infrastructure and Wi-Fi, you could block Facebook, YouTube, Google in an enormous number of places, not a private home, but in a lot of other places, just through the power of the purse. I never thought of that.
That's absolutely right. And, the Biden administration is showing Republicans how to really use executive power. So many executive orders just in the first month of the Biden administration. So Republican governors need to start doing what Republicans aren't really used to doing, which is weaponizing executive government. And I mean, if you had all of these, like I said, if you had all these federal agencies on alternative platforms, that would have knock-on effects. All the journalists, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, would have to go to these alternative platforms as well to get the latest news. Mm-hmm. So it could cause a nice chain reaction there.
Yeah, and you get the big Republican states, I mean, Texas and Florida being the obvious examples. That's a lot of people. That's tens of millions of people. And there's a lot of media in those two states too. Let me shift gears a little bit. I asked you what other states would be interested, and you, I think, correctly said it would be Republicans. But I see in your article, and I tell you, I learned so much from your Breitbart stories. Let me just read the headline of a new one. Senate Antitrust Reform Bill targets big tech's monopoly power. And when I read that, I thought, well, hang on, the Republicans don't control the U.S. Senate anymore, which I find terrifying. But this is a bill that Democrats support, am I right?
That's right. It has real bipartisan support, and it doesn't really address the censorship issue because it's, the Democrats are on board with it. But it doesn't, as far as I can tell, it doesn't tell the tech companies, well, they have to censor misinformation, they have to censor hate speech as well. So that makes it a little bit better than some of the other Democrat proposals we've seen, like the one from the New York Attorney General and some of the stuff that Biden's been talking about. What it does do, which is interesting, is target big tech's exclusionary practices, its anti-competitive practices. So this is the way in which companies like Google and Apple and Facebook cut deals to crowd out competitors. So one good example of this is how Google paid Apple over $1 billion, I think, to make Google search the default search on Apple smartphones. And obviously, competitors to Google, smaller search engines, don't have that kind of money, which allows Google to really dominate the marketplace because obviously Google and Apple, they control 99% or more of smartphone operating systems worldwide. So that's the entire smartphone market. So by targeting practices like that, this bill could make it, well, it doesn't target political bias directly. It could make things easier for competing search engines that aren't as politically co-opted as Google to start gaining some market share.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.